Hey, this one's going to be about something that I lived through, that we all lived through. I picked up the paper this morning and it was about Lincoln Kennedy. Lincoln, we fought a war, the Civil War, and he went to Gettysburg to give an address. The Civil War was fought to free the slaves, but they never, it took, in my time, in my life, 1950s, New Brunswick, I remember Burnett Street, what it looked like, the thing, and they were never free. They weren't freed for 100 years later, they still weren't freed. And the Kennedys did help change that. So I felt it important enough to read this thing. The Gettysburg Address by Lincoln, 150 years ago. 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that this nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But in a large sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot concentrate, we cannot hollow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here have concentrated far above our power to do add or detract. The world will little know nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for the living rather to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion, that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, and for the people, shall not perish from the earth. That was the address. And then the paper with Lincoln and Kennedy. What made the Gettysburg Address one of America's greatest speeches? It's a speech we're all taught, and its words are woven into the fabric of our nation's history. 77 years ago. It was, in fact, 150 years ago this week, November 19th, 1863, when President Abraham Lincoln traveled to Gettsburg, Pennsylvania, to help dedicate the cemetery of the battlefield where 4.5 months earlier, 165,000 soldiers in blue and gray fought and 51,000 died. The battle turned the direction of the Civil War in the Union Army's favor. Lincoln had intended the address to honor the dead, but he also saw it as an opportunity to frame the 31-month-old war in a new light, to provide new meaning for that bloody conflict, to apply a greater universality of freedom in reaffirming the Declaration of Independence. His Emancipation Proclamation, effective at the beginning of the year, had freed slaves, but only those in states belonging to the Confederacy. The address would be another major step toward freeing all slaves 2 years later.
On November 19th, Lincoln traveled to Gettysburg to dedicate the new Union Cemetery. The featured speaker was Edward Everett of Massachusetts, a diplomat, clergyman, and celebrated orator.
concise, vivid.
The president had been invited almost as an afterthought to offer a few appropriate remarks.
Phrase was clearly a deliberate attempt.
Everett spoke for not quite 2 hours.
And at the
Then
same
Lincoln
time,
rose.
lend a certain gravity to his address.
A local photographer took his time focusing.
Celebration.
Presumably, the president could be counted on to go on for a while. But he spoke just 269 words. He started off by reminding his audience that just 87 years had passed since the founding of the nation. And then he went on to embolden the Union cause with some of the most stirring words ever spoken. Lincoln was heading back to his seat before the photographer could open the shutter.
So conceived and so dedicated can long endure that Lincoln shows his hand. The war was about
He felt that he had failed, that it was a poor speech, that the people didn't like it. It was so brief, less than 2 minutes. He felt that he had failed. Lehman, his friend Ward Lehman, was sitting next to him on the stand. When he sat down, there was just a sprinkling of applause. And he said, "Lehman, that speech won't scowl. That's what you say about a plow in the prairies when the mud doesn't come off it."
The cheek of every American must tingle with shame as he reads the silly, flat, dishwatery utterances of the man who has to be pointed out to intelligent foreigners as the President of the United States. Chicago Times.
Dear Mr. President, I should be glad if I could flatter myself that I came as near to the central idea of the occasion in 2 hours as you did in 2 minutes. Edward Everett.
Means investing more time, not less. Edward Everett, who well understood these matters, wrote Lincoln the day after the speech. I should be glad if I could flatter myself that I came as near as to the central idea of the occasion in 2 hours as you did in 2 minutes. Question: Lincoln stated the world will little note nor long remember what we say here. Did he really have no idea that his speech would be revered so greatly? Familiar. Nothing I can say here today can do justice to Lincoln. Is here employing to emphasize the magnitude of the soldier's sacrifice that he is exaggerating, but the world can never forget what they did here. Is understood the poetic license and part of the conversation. The irony, of course, from our point of view, is that the speech today is famous and even familiar around the world, and certainly ranks as one of the most admired and memorable speeches of all time. While I doubt very much that Lincoln could have had any sense of that, others did. The opinion of Senator Charles Sumner, the learned and imposing Republican leader from Massachusetts, was described by a friend as follows: of all the speeches he ever read in any language by any man, living or dead, he thought Lincoln's Gettysburg address was the greatest. Lincoln said, "The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it will never forget what they did here," Sumner said. The speech would live when the memory of the battle would be lost, or only be remembered because of the speech. Abraham Lincoln helped straighten out, made the attempt, and 100 years later. Okay, this article had 2 parts: Lincoln and problem, John F. Kennedy. It had been raining all that morning in Dallas, but just as Air Force One touched down at Love Field, the skies cleared, the sun came out. The Secret Service detail, knowing the president's strong preferences, ordered the car's bubble top removed so that the crowd lining downtown street could see and cheer John and Jacqueline Kennedy. And what if the rain had not stopped that November 22nd, 1963? What if the bubble top had obscured the vision of the assassin, just enough to spare John F. Kennedy that fatal shot. For some historians, the what-if question is little more than an intellectual power game. What matters, they argue, is only what did happen, not what might have happened, or what might have happened. I think they are profoundly wrong. When we ask them the right questions about what might have been, we can learn important issues and lessons. Not only how contingent history is, but also what kind of qualities we want and need in the leadership we choose. So imagine that the rain in Dallas saves John Kennedy's life, that he survives and returns to Washington. Here are just some of the questions that would arise in the weeks, months, and years that followed. Would Lyndon Johnson's career have ended? LBJ biography. The vice president was facing two dangers to his future on the very day Kennedy was shot. A Senate committee was investigating charges he had taken kickbacks, and Life magazine was also about to launch a probe into how he had gotten so rich in a lifetime of government service. Kennedy's death put both investigations into the deep freeze. No one wanted to inject more trauma into an already shocked and shaken nation. Had JFK survived, however, those investigations would have accelerated. Do we want someone, a heartbeat from the Oval Office, who might be ethically, even legally compromised? The prospect of Johnson being forced out of office as an election year approached would have been a distinct possibility. Would JFK
the energy, the faith, the devotion
accelerated
which
Vietnam?
we bring to this endeavor will light our country and
For
all
many,
who
the answer
serve it.
depends on whether you're an
And the
admirer of
glow
it
from
or a
that
critic
fire
of Kennedy. He'd grown
can truly
skeptical of
light the
U.S.
world.
military's assumption that the
And
close
so,
brush
my fellow
with nuclear
Americans,
war was during the
ask
1962
not
Cuban Missile
what
Crisis
your
had
country
made him
can do for
determined to
you.
move away
Ask
from
what
the
you can
framework
do
of
for
Cold
your
War
country.
thinking. He was clear about doing nothing until after the 1964 re-election.
It's the president's responsibility to see that a
points to a
federal court
stealth
order was carried out,
disengagement
an order
in his
directing
second term.
Alabama Governor
And
George
there'd been no
Wallace to
Vietnam
admit
War
black
would-
students to
we
the
would
state
likely have been
university.
spared much of
Wallace
the
has vowed to defy the court order.
devices
and
poisonous
personally
climate
block
of the
the
late
schoolhouse door.
1960s. We would have had a
Next question.
counterculture with a sex, drugs, and rock and roll flavor, demographics and changing.
I didn't think so. It just really depends on whether we have
Would have
something
seen
trouble
in
from the
that,
university, then I would.
The
But
flag
otherwise,
burning,
I think
the
we would
race
at this point.
of revolutionary
I think it would be
violence
helpful even
would
if
have been.
we don't have the problem now.
far
I
less
think it would
likely.
take away a lot of the
Would JFK have
problems that we have
successfully
in the present
passed civil rights?
Hopeful to legislate.
Johnson's
You mean in the
mastery
legislature?
of the Senate served him well as president. When the 1964 Civil Rights Act was passed, one of the most powerful segregationists, Senator Richard Russell of Georgia, said, "We could have beaten John Kennedy on civil rights, but not Lyndon Johnson." Had Kennedy's lifelong philandering continued, the stories could have posed a moral threat to his political survival. Indeed, without Johnson's Southern roots for the legacy of a martyred president, it's far from clear that a Civil Rights Act could have passed the Senate in 1964, or even after JFK's re-election. Or is it clear that Kennedy would have even proposed an agenda as ambitious as LBJ's Great Society? Unlike Johnson, who wanted to be a second FDR, Kennedy thought in much less sweeping terms, beyond Medicare, which he advocated his first term. Kennedy's domestic ambitions were far less
We observe
grand or
today
grandiose.
not a victory of party,
What about the
but a
private life?
celebration of freedom.
It's often forgotten that
Symbolizing
JFK's
an
reckless philandering
as well as a
came
beginning,
close to public exposure
signifying
just weeks
renewal,
before his death. It took
as well
all
as
of Robert
change.
Kennedy's powers to keep the
For I
question
have
out of
sworn
the
before
media.
you
Had John Kennedy survived and had his lifelong behavior continued, the stories could have posed a mortal threat to his political survival.
Kennedy addressed his message to America,
Although the Kennedys would have used all the powers at their disposal to keep the
and the speech
scandal from taking root.
Service.
You might disagree with any or all of my conclusions. Anyone who asserts with certainty a knowledge of the future is, for me, disqualified from being taken seriously. Nor do we know, for instance, the answer to other key issues like whether JFK's health would have made him an invalid the second term. Small twists of fate can determine whom you will spend your life with, where you will live, what work you will do, whether your ambitions will meet with success or failure. And small twists of fate, like the weather on a November Friday, may also determine who will lead a nation along what path. The story in Star Ledger of three men. Honest Abe, who I didn't know. He lived 150 years before my time. But he had the nickname Honest Abe. Jack Kennedy, President, and President Lyndon Johnson. Kennedy assassinated. Philandering, fought his demons, I suppose, but he was trying. And his brother, they were trying. They put the first ones in that school down south, and well, they fought to accomplish that. And we had fought a civil war. But Lyndon Baines Johnson was the guy who had the pull, and he had his problems. He got to be a rich man in public office, extremely rich. That's the story, and how little things determine your fate. Who you marry, where you go to school, where you wind up working, and just Lincoln's words, and then we'll close this out. His final words of that speech. That this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and this is the important, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. That's it. Lincoln, John F. Kennedy with the civil rights, and Lyndon Baines Johnson, who really did the job and got it in the rest of the way. And if anyone still carries those prejudice things around in their hearts, it'll be buried with you, because it isn't going to continue. This is the land of the free. I might also suggest my video on the Civil War reenactment, it's on Smug Mug